Hello and welcome. Today's presentation is bleeding management. Save someone from bleeding to death. And if you have any questions along the way, you can put those in the chat and we'll do a Q&A at the end. The speaker for CERT today is Eddie Williams. Eddie is a retired EMT paramedic, critical incident stress management and disaster psychology instructor with CERT and our District 7 coordinator. Hi, Eddie.
Hi, Serenity. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Pretty good. That sandwich is making me hungry, though.
It looks good.
Yes. Bleeding management. This is one of my favorite subjects. And my question to you is, how serious is it? There are several kinds of bleeding, and as we go along, we'll be covering that. What I want to give you some basic anatomy and physiology, just real quick. The blood bleeding, loss of blood, is a serious factor in major cases. In minor cases, usually we can get bleeding stopped real quick. Blood has two purposes. Its primary purpose is to deliver oxygen molecules to the cells of the body, the major organs and other structures within the body. The secondary part of your blood system is to deliver the carbon dioxide, that is the exchange with the oxygen. The blood picks up carbon dioxide and delivers it to the heart and the lungs to get replenished with oxygen. So when we breathe in, we're delivering oxygen to the lungs, to the heart, and then to the rest of the cells. When we breathe out, we exhale that carbon dioxide that has been returned from the cells at all levels. How serious is it? Okay, the body of an adult, 160 to 180 pounds, has a volume of a normal person of 10.5 pints or 1.2 to 1.5 gallons or 4.5 to 5.5 liters. A loss of blood of anywhere from 5 to 10% in a major injury can be the beginning of the stages of shock. If you tuned in last week on the RPMs delivered by Dr. Owens, she went over most of the signs of shock, so we won't get into that too much today. So anyway, the blood picks up the oxygen from the lungs, goes back through the heart, and is delivered through the arteries into the veins and then into the capillary. And then it picks up at the capillary level, the carbon dioxide, and it goes in reverse. Types of bleeding. There are three types of bleeding that are external, and there's one that's internal, and that's just basically internal bleeding. Capillary bleeding is the least of the bleeding worries that you might encounter. For instance, anybody that's been shaving their legs or their face, or maybe has a paper cut, that is an example of capillary bleeding. Although, if you cut yourself too much or too bad with a shaving, that can also involve some venous bleeding too. Venous bleeding, what you'll see is a flow of blood that is continuous. In the capillary, generally what we see is just some bleeding that's very slow, and then it may look like it's stopped. You wipe your hand with the dressing and there's no more bleeding. And then all of a sudden you see some more bleeding. A venous bleeding from your veins will just continuously bleed, but it'll be in a slow direction. Now, capillary bleeding, generally its color can be red, but it can also be a dark red. In venous bleeding, if it's coming back to the heart and the pulmonary system to get more oxygen, that bleeding is going to be a real dark red, maybe even just almost a brownish in color. So between those two, we're dealing with probably bleeding management that can be handled very easily. When you get into arterial bleeding, that's a much more serious situation. What'll happen is if you cut an artery, and if anybody ever has, I hope you haven't, but if anybody has, what you'll see is actual spurting of blood. Every time the heart contracts and delivers the blood through the circulatory system, when it reaches the injury point, you'll see it spurt. And if your pulse rate is about, say, 70, you'll see in a minute probably 70 spurts. But if you're losing blood at a rapid rate, you're going to see that increase in the amount of blood that you're losing, and it'll be faster. Here's the key. Let's go to how to manage some of these injuries. The veins and arteries, as I just described, arteries come from the heart and are very high pressure. When you get your blood pressure taken, when you get the top number, that's going to be most of the blood in your arteries. When you get the lower pressure, the last number, that's going to be blood that's returning generally from your veins. And then the next slide will show us a little bit about capillary. You can see where this young man fell either off his bike or just fell running, and he scraped his knee. Now it can be a scrape or it can be a cut. A scrape generally won't bleed too much. You'll see some real slow oozing, and the main thing is that it's going to not be a major situation, but for a young person or even for adults, it can be kind of scary. Main thing you want to do is make sure that it's not bleeding continuously, that the bleeding is very slow and oozing. And when you take a look at that and you're ready to dress it, clean and dress the wound with a dressing. Make sure that you got any dirt or any sand or anything off of there. And then in some cases, you can apply just a simple Band-Aid. In other cases, you may have to apply a dressing and then use a gauze pad or gauze wrap to secure it in place. Now, venous bleeding is a little bit worse. It's a steady but slow flow in most cases. It's a darker red in color, and these injuries can be anywhere from like cutting yourself, a little knife cut when you're dicing tomatoes and onions and so forth. But remember, it's doesn't have much oxygen in it. So it's going to be kind of darker colored than what you'll see the bright red, which is in the arteries. Now, apply pressure. This is real simple to take care of. Apply pressure, direct pressure to the wound. Say, for instance, your palm of your hand has a pretty good cut on there and it's bleeding pretty well. Apply pressure, but use something to isolate you personally from that wound, such as a dressing. If you don't have anything else, look for a Kleenex. You can even use toilet paper, a handkerchief, but you want to try and use something that's as clean as possible and apply that right to the wound, and then apply some pressure to that wound with your other hand, and then apply that pressure and maintain that pressure, and then elevate the injury above the level of the heart. It's important to apply it above the level of the heart because that will also slow it down. So venous bleeding can be, and don't get this confused, it can be kind of on the verge of seriousness. Some people will faint if they see that much blood coming out. But remember, you're not going to probably lose 5 or 10% of your blood supply. Apply that pressure and elevate. Now in the arterial, you can see the heart pumping. Imagine that heart pumping, and every time it pumps, blood is going to spurt out of that wound. And it'll actually spurt out. I've seen blood spurt out as far as about 5 to 6 feet away from the injury. And it can do that, but what happens is over a period of time, that bleeding will begin to lessen and the spurting won't be as far and the pulsations won't be as much. Now, remember, arterial bleeding is bright red in color. It's what's carrying all the oxygen. It carries the oxygen to all the cells. So if you're losing arterial blood, that's a serious injury to your major organs. The first one, your head, your brain. Cerebral hemorrhage or any kind of hemorrhage that reduces the amount of flow to the brain is serious. Next are the kidneys. Kidneys begin to fail and the brain begins to deteriorate after about 4 or 5 minutes without oxygen. So this is an important thing. This is real quick. This is a real true emergency. Similar procedure. Apply pressure directly to the wound, and you're really going to have to apply pressure, a lot of hard pressure than probably in venous bleeding. Elevate the extremity above the head. Elevate it. Apply pressure, direct pressure, and elevate. And then call 911 or have somebody else call 911 right away. If this goes on for very much time, and as I said, you get into a 5 to 10% loss of your blood volume, that begins to be serious. And the RPMs that were talked about last week, you'll see the respirations. At first, you may see them begin to increase, and then they'll start to decrease. What they're starting to increase for is they're trying to compensate to get more oxygen through the body. But once your heart no longer can keep up with the loss of blood, they'll decrease. And the level of consciousness or the mental state of that person will also decrease. So you'll begin to see the body will begin to cool down. And also just look at how much blood is lost on the floor or wherever they're at. When you see more blood than what 2 hands could possibly cover, that's serious bleeding. So remember, apply direct pressure immediately, elevate the extremity or other part of the body above the head and call 911 and let them know you have an arterial bleed. So kind of review for all of them, it's direct pressure, apply a dressing, elevate, and apply pressure and elevation. And if the dressing that you have applied begins to get soaked, don't remove it. Apply another one on top of it. Somewhat controversial in some places, but for the most part, the dressing, what you'll see, will absorb, and then once it absorbs, it will begin to not stop the bleeding very well. So that's why we want to put on another one. Okay, so think of this. Any serious disruption of any blood through any one of those 3 types of bleeding creates a large lack of oxygen to get to your vital organs. And I think what we'll do now is if anybody has any questions about this, feel free to enter the chat room and we'll see what we can do. And I really appreciate this. I appreciate the library for taking their time out to work with CERT on this. And I tell you, just knowing these simple steps and these simple things can really help in a true emergency of bleeding. So I thank you. And I see we have probably one question at least here.
Thank you, Eddie. That was very helpful information. We do have one question so far, and the question is, what is a dressing?
Okay, a dressing is, there's several kinds. There are just plain gauze. The gauze is just like a gauze. It's usually in 2 by 2 size, 2 inch by 2 inch sizes, 4 inch by 4 inch sizes. and can go up as far as 12 by 12 sizes for major wounds. What will happen is when you put that gauze on and you apply direct pressure, that will allow coagulation of the blood, so that when coagulation occurs, that actually it thickens the blood and it begins to slow down. So that's what a gauze pad is. You'll also see some that are non-adherent. They'll have a kind of a slick film on them. You can get these at any pharmacy. You can get them at any store practically. And like I said, you can get them in sizes of 2 by 2 or up to 3 by 3, 4 by 4, and even larger. You should also probably get some gauze wrap, because it's hard to hold a gauze pad down on an injury with just tape or something like that. You can use a gauze roll and just wrap it around. Okay, I hope that answered that question.
Okay, and if you have any more questions, go ahead and enter those now.
Okay, Monique, I wouldn't think that toilet paper or paper towels would be good. I guess, you know, that's a good point. They're not my favorite, but I would recommend them if you have nothing else. And that's why I suggest that. Another question from Steve. Would a tourniquet be applied during a severe arterial bleed? Not by untrained personnel, not by untrained personnel. Now there's a process going on to treat stop the bleeding. Stop the bleeding is the class that's taught, and it takes about 4 hours. And what that does, it teaches the entire scope of bleeding management, which includes a tourniquet. Tourniquets are not there for the last resort. If you have arterial bleeding that is absolutely you can't get stopped, you know, that's up to that's up to you. I am not going to encourage tourniquets just based upon a lot of my experience, but my experience is most of the time bleeding control can be done by pressure points and other methods. If you use a tourniquet, you really need to know where to apply it, how to apply it, and the long-term effects of it being applied. I hope that helps in that question. Another one, let's see here. Is there another one here? Let's see here. From Blanca, can you explain about oxygenation in the blood again? Certainly. The respiratory system, when we breathe and we inhale, we're inhaling about 21% oxygen. That's how much oxygen is in the air that we breathe in, with a bunch of other gases. When it gets through the heart and goes through the lungs, and then it is picked up, it goes through these capillaries, and then it goes into these little sacs in the lungs, very, very small sacs. They're called alveoli. That's where oxygen is exchanged, goes into the arteries, and the veins drop off in that same alveolar sac carbon dioxide. So when that blood becomes oxygenated, the oxygen causes the blood to become red. When there's carbon dioxide in the blood system, then that generally means that the blood's going to be darker or even closer to a bluish color. Any other questions? Okay. Hey, I thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be in on this, and I hope that nobody ever has to encounter serious arterial bleed. Any mother and probably every dad and every kid has had some serious kind of bleeding that you run across one time or another. and it's pretty, bleeding is a major, I mean, to the normal eye, bleeding looks like a lot. And you lose just a little bit of blood, and that can worry people, mothers and fathers. Heck, it can even worry paramedics. I've had to worry many times. But anyway, again, I appreciate everybody here, and I hope that you'll keep this in mind and take a look at the slides again if you can. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eddie. Thank you. That was very helpful. And thank you, CERT. Next Tuesday's presentation is going to be on fire safety. Safely use a fire extinguisher on small fires. And you can register for that on the library's event page. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.